This week, I'd like to discuss a little bit about political culture because that gets a lot of attention in your readings for this week. And I'll say I agree with most of their things they say, which is a good thing. Uh, but I'd also throw in a couple warnings, a couple caveats about political culture and how we use it, how we analyze it. Because what I've found in the past is political culture or culture writ more broadly can very easily fall into stereotypes. Let me give you two examples, one personal and one from a more academic sort of thing. From the personal side, I worked for a year as a liaison officer with Iraqi intelligence during the war. And the Iraqi intelligence center I was with, we'd get a lot of visitors, senior officers, senior officials coming in to talk to them and find out what they were doing, essentially. And the typical pattern was they would come in and they'd be just extremely nervous about offending the Iraqis. And they would be, things like don't use your left hand for anything. Don't show them the bottom of your feet, etc., etc., etc. All of which is good, and all of which has validity. But they had learned their cultural knowledge through training material that essentially was, all Arabs are like this. And I remember one time after a visit like that, the person clearly was very nervous and he had left. And one of the Iraqi officials with whom I was working turned and told me, I really wish they'd remember we're Baghdadis, not Bedouin. Okay. In other words, their culture was a little different. Their culture was a little more Western. Their viewpoint of the world was, I won't say Western, but it wasn't, desert Bedouin. And it's all too easy to forget that. It's like Arabs think, well, I've worked all over the Middle East at one point or another. And the political culture in Egypt is different than it is in Iraq. It's different than it is in Jordan. Within Egypt, the political culture around Cairo is very different than it is out in the Sinai. So we have to be a little careful here on how broadly we talk about political culture. Yeah, in some cases, there will be a national political culture, but not all the time. And this has led to a lot of problems politically and diplomatically. From a U.S. standpoint, um, I will use the example of the last election, in which, as of now, it looks as though Trump got the majority of male Latino votes. Okay. And this shocked a lot of people because, according to all the standard books, standard studies, Latinos tend to be Democratic voters. Well, two issues here. One is if one uses the term Latino or Latinx, if you prefer, that covers a whole lot of different people. And something that people recognize, but I think forget, is the political culture for Cubanos, people originally from were from Cuba or whose parents or grandparents were from Cuba. Their political culture differs very, very significantly, for instance, than people who are of Mexican ancestry. So you sort of lump all these categories into one, and you're already going to have some analytical problems. Beyond that, though, what the exit polls suggested was that the people who had been living in the U.S., including Mexicans along the U.S. Mexico border who had been living in the U.S. legally for years um, had some real issues with undocumented aliens for a number of reasons, economic and some other reasons. So even when you start talking about immigrants from one country into the U.S., their experiences are going to be different and they're going to be uh, highly variable. So we've got to be careful with political culture. Yes, it exists, but it's permeable. Your readings emphasize the role of the family, which probably is in many ways the most critical. On the other hand, schools will impact it, although, again, your readings sort of minimize that a bit, but schools will impact it, dealing with other students. Occupations will impact it. Economic status certainly will impact it. So, yes, I think the push for understanding political culture is important, but always be cautious when you're using it and uh, try to avoid the stereotyping because in some cases that can cost you an election. Okay, thank you.